Welcome to Rethinking Constraints, the podcast where we explore the big questions shaping our future. I'm your host, Jerry Mikulski. Today's conversation tackles one of the most pressing and complicated issues of our time, masculinity. What does it mean to be a man in 2025? How did we get to a place where young men feel so lost and left behind? And perhaps most importantly, what does healthy masculinity actually look like? I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Moe Carrick, an organizational development expert, author, and keen observer of how gender dynamics shape our workplaces, families, and society. Together, we wade into the tension between outdated masculine norms that refuse to die and emerging definitions that haven't quite taken hold. We explore how the far right built catcher's mitts for disaffected young men, why feminist progress somehow left boys and men languishing, and whether concepts like stewardship and emotional awareness can help us chart a better path forward. This is an honest, sometimes uncomfortable conversation between two people trying to make sense of a cultural moment where everything feels up for grabs. We don't have all the answers, but we're asking the right questions. Let's dive in.
What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about masculinity these days?
We're in trouble.
What kind of trouble?
I think our notions of masculinity are changing in some good ways, but I think that we're in trouble because we're in an environment right now where it feels like there's some old notions of masculinity that are dying or trying to die in opening space for new norms and definitions of what it means to be both masculine, but also to be male. I think they're different. And at the same time, there's some pressures and some forces that are pretty relentless in our society. I think there's also pressures on keeping outdated notions of masculinity. So I think we've got this competition happening right now. That's a lot. You just asked, what did I think of?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
I love that nexus. We're in a time when masculinity was kind of being rethought, reworked, re-somethinged with some degree of progress, but without enough clarity or enough oomph or enough anything to counteract the fact that there's a lot of people out there who are feeling shut down, ignored, lost, left out, left behind, whatever else it might be. And they needed something strong to seize. And so what they've reached out for is a bunch of stuff that for me is not healthy masculinity, is toxic masculinity, whatever you want to call it. But this sort of goes into a strategic thing where there's a whole bunch of people on the far right who figured out that there were young men who were feeling this way. And were like, so they built catcher's mitts designed exactly to receive young men and say, hey, we've got you. Go do MMA, join MAGA, do whatever else. The seduction community plays in here. There's a whole series of things that are really quite dysfunctional that fit together hand in glove, to mix love metaphors, but that are really concerning because I don't think of them as being about a kind of masculinity that's good for our future and good for our planet, good for our communities, good for whatever else. And I'm sad because I saw some of that work happening. It just never achieved any kind of clarity or liftoff. And it's hard to compete with MMA for the appearance of strength, right? It's just really hard when somebody thinks masculinity is about being overpowering and may the strongest fighter win. You've got to be strong in a completely different way. And there is a different kind of strength. It just doesn't play as well on TV.
Yeah, I'm with you about that, like the attractiveness of that pull, especially if you are lost. I can remember, Jerry, many, many years ago, I was an exchange student in England. I was lonely and sad and depressed. And I remember I went to a grocery store. It was pouring rain outside, and I was just like looking at the shelf, and I didn't know what I was looking for. I was mostly homesick. I missed my boyfriend. I was just like, whoa. And I got predated. How do you say that word?
Whatever it is, whatever the victim side of that is.
Yeah. Me. Yeah, I think it was like a cult or something. This person came and started asking me, like, was I lonely? And did I have a spiritual, maybe it was a religion. I'm not sure. Did I have a spiritual basis? And at first I started talking to them because they were like friendly and it was appealing. And then I realized, whoa, wait a second. No, I don't want to talk to or go to your place to learn about this group of people that you hang with. And so I got out of there really fast. But I remember thinking, like, even all the many years since that, I've thought, boy, to be vulnerable and then to have and to feel like an outsider and then to have someone tell you, I have a place where you can be on the inside, like that just feels really good, even for a moment. I think that's part one for me. And I think part two, and I might have spoken about this a little bit in my TED Talk, I'm not sure, but I have felt this tension as a feminist because I feel like I've benefited from feminism. My mother was an early feminist. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I got a lot of messaging about I could be anything I wanted. I could do anything I wanted. And I'm grateful. Like, I am a feminist. I believe in the rights of women, and I'm proud of who my daughter and daughters-in-law have become. And at the same time, as also a parent of sons, a wife, a daughter, I've seen women like me benefit from policies, from support groups, from investment in women's empowerment and really women's rights, simultaneous to very little happening for men and boys.
Mhm.
And so there's been this strong uptick, and then there's been this languishing. And I feel like somehow we took our eye off the ball, and I can even remember as a young parent, a young mother, I remember as my sons who are now in their 30s, when they were in like middle school, I can remember dear friends of mine who were mothers of daughters. So the kids had all been having play dates for many, many years. And then they started saying things like, well, is it okay for your boys to still come and play? And I'd be like, they're not.
What?
They're friends. They're not going to harm your girls. And I was sort of aghast, but then I was also like, oh, also, I understand. So there's been some, this is going to be a strong word to say, but I think there's been some demonizing of what masculinity means, even by women who love men. And that has concerned me too, because it contributes to the dynamic. And I'm curious because we both have experienced a culture of the masculine and the feminine. But as a little boy and as a young man and now as a grown man, I'm curious, how have you internalized, or where did you get messages about what it meant to be a man?
My dad, Jack, was a man's man without being a macho man. And he was great with me. He taught me a whole series of things. He taught me shooting, carpentry, electrical, painting, drawing, aerodynamics, swimming. There's this whole list of things that my dad taught me. And that every time I do any of those things, I'm like, oh, I love that. Also, I have my dad's hands. So when I see my hands at work, I'm reminded of my dad. He also had a huge forehead. So I loved my dad, and he was really good at bringing me up and in to these things that I just mentioned. But I somehow also grew up really not liking men, being very disappointed in men. And for me, the drunken frat boy is the picture of the man I never, ever wanted to be.
Yeah.
And you can play that drunken frat boy out, grows up to be a whole bunch of different things. I was just really disappointed in men and found that women were more intelligent, more sensitive, more connected all the time. And so I was like, what's up with this? Why are men so often just obsessed with the wrong things and off in this direction? I remember getting that at a relatively young age. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why, but somehow men behaving badly was an early trope for me. I didn't want to become anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is hard when you have to orphan potentially parts of yourself in order not to become something that's undesirable. And I'm thinking, as you're speaking, about what Jennifer Bosom says, who's from the University of Florida, who's researched masculinity a lot. She says in particular that men, from the time they're little boys, are given a very narrow band of emotional life and emotional expression. And I think that contributes, doesn't it, to the disappointment that may happen as boys become men. I'm thinking about, have you ever seen that movie, The Mask We Live In?
I've heard of it. I don't think I've seen it.
It's a documentary. It was produced quite a long time ago by the same people that produced the Misrepresentation Project, which is about women and how women are portrayed in media. So The Mask You Live In came out as a pair to that movie, which is really about how men and boys are portrayed and are messaged. And they actually re-edited and re-released the movie a couple of years ago. It's very good. And they talk about the same thing. And in particular, they talk about how boys have really very close, often emotionally deep friendships up until about middle school, and then they fall off, and rugged individualism starts to pervade around, in particular, emotional connectedness for men.
You know who the director of the doc is?
No.
It's Jennifer Newsom, Gavin Newsom's wife, which is part of the Representation Project, which is, I think, the thing you're talking about as well.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
That
Jennifer
makes
Newsom.
sense. Wow.
Yeah.
Didn't know that. They're both really very powerful films, and they get you really thinking about what was embedded in me. What did I learn I think about both my sons who have pursued the company of men. They both are cisgender and identify as hetero, but they have longed for male friendship. One of my sons is in recovery. The other one's suffered from some depression. They've really found it in a community of men, but they have to work pretty hard to find other men who are wanting to connect.
It's interesting because I said that I didn't really like men that much. And I've got great male friends now, male and female friends, no problem. My sport is Aikido. And there's men and women on the mat in a dojo, more men than women. But I'm really close to some of the men there and so forth. That's very interesting. I wanted to point out that there's the masculinity set of issues. And then behind those lie a series of other issues, one of which is, for me, my journey starts like mid 90s when I realized I don't like the word consumer. And for me, like consumerism alienates us from each other, takes away our sense of interdependence and our sense of agency, replaces our civic duty with our duty to just buy more crap, even if we don't need it, because that keeps the whole engine going. And I think that part of the reason we're unmoored and wondering what to do is modernity plus consumerization. We killed God, we killed religion. There's still a lot of religious people. There's a lot of faiths in this country in particular, but we killed God and then we killed whatever else to anchor to. So there aren't good things to anchor to. There's that. And then the second thing that's lying behind all of this is DEI, diversity, Me Too, that there are historic injustices that have happened to women and to people of color all over the place to a magnitude nobody seems to understand, and that we are now busy like pendulum swinging completely away from. The Trump 2 administration is very definitely an abreaction to efforts made, good faith, but I think mostly terribly stupid efforts made to balance that equation. The things we tried to do to fix that set of injustices, those sets of problems, they weren't working, and weren't working so much that when the far right blew a bunch of oxygen on those embers, they just turned into a flaming bonfire in the living room and led to the moment we're living through right now. Those things are right behind this masculinity crisis for boys and men, because the consumer thing, lose your rudder, aimlessness, don't know where to turn. The women have been getting so much benefit. People of color have been getting advantages, and the ignoring of men because they've had the benefit for so long, they're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And so we forgot about them. To me, that just forms this really toxic nexus I'm very interested in, because the frame for the Rethinking the Future part of the podcast that we're sitting in, the frame is, what positive things can we do?
Yeah.
What things can we do looking forward that are actually going to contribute to making our kids' futures better?
Yeah. It's interesting. You didn't use this word, but I think something you're speaking to very powerfully, and I promise I'll get there about what we can do. I think you're speaking to shame. You're speaking to how have we demonized the parts of ourself as being unworthy, even as we've tried to celebrate diversity and difference. It's one of the things I've thought about a lot as a practitioner in the realm of DEI programs for many large and small companies over the last 20 years, is how we never meant to shame people, but I think we have. I think that I know from my own personal experience that like understanding my own embedded racism, sexism, homophobia, I have to understand what I inherited that impacts my perspective in order to become more capable of seeing and valuing and being able to connect across difference. And I think somehow that process has resulted in some people, very probably appropriately in some ways, feeling ashamed of themselves. And none of us, when we are made to feel shame, we protect ourselves.
Mhm.
Such a horrible feeling of unworthiness, for connection, that we can't help but be defensive. And so I wonder sometimes, what have we done that even in the practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to actually do the opposite of not have
Right.
people feel included because they feel ashamed. And so I think for me, part of the antidote is actually learning how we be shame resilient, how we can stand in both I am enough, and also I sometimes do things that inadvertently cause harm. I sometimes do things that might be sexist, racist, or heteronormative, but I am still a good person. How do I stand in those places? So I was thinking about shame, and I think of even, again, like, how do I internalize this work? And I think of myself as a young woman growing up in the age of women's liberation, wanting and believing that I could have it all. And then entering a field, which the field I entered early on was that of wilderness education and a mountain guide, and realizing that I was a minority amongst men, which has been true in my corporate experience. And so getting really pretty good at acting masculine. But a lot of white women I know who have been in business or have been athletes, they say, I can do white guy just as good as anybody, because we learn that's one of the ways we need to show up to assimilate into the world. And then it can be very complicated to figure out, how do I embrace those parts of myself that may carry what society says are masculine while also being true to who I am. And a good example for me comes up with the notion of ambition, because I think ambition is really revered in male society. It's actually not talked about very easily in the society of women. And so that, to me, that's a dimension of myself I could put in the category of masculine, but it's part of who I am. I'm not a man, but I have ambition. And how do I learn to embrace that part of myself, to value that part of myself? And the same could be said for men in other characteristics, such as being a feeling person, being someone who has tenderness. If I'm a man, how do I do that?
And our attitudes about ambition are just one of the many double standards in the US about men and women.
Yeah.
And there are so many double standards. A tiny thing, the pink tax, right? How much women earn less. Okay. But they also have to spend a whole lot more on products and on things for work, for example, to be dressed and show up at work. Like guys, there was very funny. There was some article in the Too Many Things scrolling past me. Emma Watson and the redheaded boy who was acting next to her, I'm forgetting the actor's name. Anyway, there were 3 different photos of her completely gussied up and him standing next to her going to events. And he was in torn jeans, a t-shirt, and Converse sneakers, looking completely like a mutt. And she was dressed to the nines differently each time. And she was like, why is it? If I showed up in torn jeans and a t-shirt and a sloppy whatever, all hell would be raised, right? What's the deal here? And so ambition, and I love the words you're putting in the conversation, because each of them, they blossom into so many different things, right? But why do ambitious women get called things that you don't want to be called? And ambitious men are like, yo, well, yeah, of course.
Totally.
It's nuts.
Totally. Yeah, which shows up when we're trying to look at real transformation. So like one of the realities that I'm seeing today and that I actually love is that we have more families where either women are the bigger wage earner or women are an equal wage earner. And yet I see men in some of those families who are becoming the caregiver at home of children or elderly, or even just taking care of the home, who find it hard to feel of value to society because they have so much pressure on their career ambition being this singular dimension of identity, despite the fact that those are choices that work for their family and that those children are lucky enough to have a primary parent. The shunning that sort of comes towards men in those kind of situations is huge, as it is shunning for women who are working and traveling and making bank, who hide that part of themselves. Which I can relate to. I can remember when I was a young parent, I remember another parent said to me in school, "Oh, it must be so hard for you to have to travel when your kids are gone." And she, like so many, would say, "Who takes care of the children?" And it got so intense, Jerry, that I used to just say, "I don't know.
I got it. I forgot
What
them.
about the kids? They're home alone."
Yeah.
And then I would say their father, or their paid caregiver, or somebody else who's very competent. I promise you, they're in good hands.
Yeah.
But that was like the most important thing for them to ask. So we do a number on ourselves with that. And I don't think we have created a full picture yet of masculine characteristics that are favorable, that need to be part of leadership, and they need to be part of the home, and they need to be part of how we show up, not demonized, but valued alongside the feminine characteristics that matter to us as human beings. And I continue to feel like we have an opportunity to define those things more beautifully.
May I invite you to throw in a piece of a definition of healthy masculinity?
Oh, God.
I know.
I haven't thought about it.
It's the big smelly fish on the table between us in some sense. It's like, okay. So what does the healthy thing look like?
I think healthy masculinity at its best is a full, I'm imagining like a full mosaic. It's a complete body of being that doesn't demonize any parts. So like for me, being healthy masculinity has the characteristics that matter in life, which include things like being able to be sensitive, being able to be loving and tender, but also being able to be capable and centered. But then, Jerry, it's interesting. If I think about it, I think, well, aren't those just characteristics of human?
Good human? Yeah.
Does the idea of good humanity cover the masculine and the feminine definitions?
We're skirting the issue of how different are men and women, right? I think we're different. People who identify as, and that whole conversation is next door to that as well.
Yeah.
But I think it's possible to come up with definitions of masculinity that are different from definitions of healthy femininity.
Yeah.
And then other people's mileage may vary because these are long-standing, but also ever-evolving questions and topics. The color for boys is blue, the color for girls is red or pink. Those colors were reversed a long time ago. They were the opposite years ago. Like we take things for granted that aren't that long-lived necessarily. And for me, one of the ways I love about healthy masculinity is stewardship. I think, and the word guardians or being a guardian is in there somewhere as well. But for me, stewardship, and there's a parallel set of ideas about the difference between stewardship and ownership, which is one of our problems, I think, with capitalism, is that libertarians think everything should be owned. And if you can protect those property rights, everything else will play out fine. And I actually think everything should be stewarded and a lot of things should be held in common. And if we do that well, then we have abundance, because if I'm not prohibited from using your pine nuts or your apples, I'm actually able to use them if I can continue their improvement over time, et cetera, et cetera. But I think men understanding how to steward the land, their families, their communities, all those kinds of things is key. I think it's a crucial skill that we're not teaching. The word is not so much even in conversation. Protect, guardian. Yeah. If you ask Jordan Peterson, he's men protect. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's the whole role. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really protect for that. Protect is you keep off my plot. You keep away from my people, stay off my plot. That's protect. But stewardship is, for me, the beginning of a whole bunch of interesting ideas about what masculinity might be like. Married to what you were just saying about connecting to your emotions. I remember a girlfriend a very long time ago saying, how do you feel about this? I don't remember what we were talking about. And I looked inside and there was like a fog bank. There was a bank of fog. I didn't really know how I felt. And as a result of that, I did a bunch of work. And these days I can pretty much report in how I feel. And I'm nowhere near as connected to my feelings and my body as April is, as my wife is.
Yeah.
Nowhere close. We're not in the same orbit for that. And I think a piece of that is role stereotypes and role assignment stuff that I've picked up unaware of, whatever else that might be. But I think stewardship is also taking care of people who are weaker than you or less. That's stewardship. You hold them and protect them, but see that maybe what you do contributes to their well-being.
Yeah, I love that. I love that language of stewardship. And I also love it because it also honors caretaking, which I think is so often relegated to the role of women, despite the realities of how many men are caregivers in their respective environments, whatever that may look like. And yet I think we have this binary piece, and a lot of it does depend on what you said, which is, I think, this societal, for these notions of masculine and feminine are societal expectations, even though I agree we are different. Like biologically, I do agree we are different. But I think some of the societal characteristics like provider, protector, decision maker are really deeply, deeply rooted and can be wonderful and also can be very damaging. So replacing that with a powerful word like stewardship, I think starts to make it a lot more resilient for both and all genders to aspire in that direction. It makes me think about a corollary there then would probably be to pick up one of the threads of femininity that is deeply rooted in women being emotionally expressive. And so being able to be emotionally expressive comes to mind as part of what masculinity may look like. We associate a lot of masculinity with strength. And I'm curious, in your experience, is that, because I think it gets really blurry, doesn't it? There's the physical strength, and then there's this stoic strength, which can get blended and blurred up with power. What do you think about that? How do we sort that?
It's really interesting because stoicism is like a hot belief system these days. A lot of people are reading Marcus Aurelius and a bunch of other people and finding therein the roots of you can only change what you can affect. You can't, the world is as it is, you need to accept it, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a piece of it's Buddhist and interesting in the sense of, yeah, life happens and you can't change everything and you should learn to accept what's going on, which is great. There's another piece of that, which is tough it out, men don't cry. Like you're in that territory, which is not that healthy. I think the Buddhist part of it is seeing the world as it really is. One of the things that's hard to do is to get rid of our belief systems and preconceptions and actually see what's really around us, because our filters filter out whatever it is we don't feel like seeing. And that's usually not that helpful in the end result, because you need to be more connected to reality. So the strength thing taps in there in the sense of in a battle of equals, whoever is the stronger will rise and win. And I'm like, yeah, no, there's a birth lot. That means some people are born with like heft and great muscles and twitch response and whatever, what have you. And one of the things I've learned from a martial art is if I run into some altercation and the other person is a couple steps ahead of me in a slightly more violent martial art. Aikido is a very peaceful art. It's very choreographed. We partner a lot, and we're trying to save the other person's life as part of what Aikido's sort of thesis is. Our dojo also does Kenpo. And I was joking with the guy who runs the Kenpo part of our dojo that in Kenpo, you're just trying to disable the other person and you will rip their arm off if you need to. And that's okay. So what I've learned is I run into somebody who's a step or two ahead of me on whatever martial art, I'm cooked. I should run as quickly as possible or try to diffuse the situation. And there's a lot of men out there. And if all we're going to do is duke it out and fight over King of the Hill, that's an ugly world that I don't want to be in. It's an ugly world I do not want to live in. I'd rather be in a world where people of lots of different sizes and shapes are fine and they can find their way to the things that they care about and are best suited for, whatever that means. Lionel Messi is probably the world's top football player, still to this day. His nickname in Spanish is La Pulga because he was a wee little kid. They had to give him growth hormones when he got to Barca because he wasn't big enough. And they were afraid he was not going to do very well because he just wasn't. And guess what?
Yeah, so interesting. And there's so much attribution that comes with that. I'm thinking about both of my sons are big guys. Their dad, both the grandpas were big, and they're 6'4", and they have some heft to them. And I remember being with them. One was in Indonesia, the other was in Senegal. I wasn't with my son in Senegal, but his dad was, and noticing the deference that they got. They actually rolled out the red carpet for my son to have him speak about the American education system. He was 19. I know nothing. I'm a student. I happen to be a big white guy. But they also both speak about how uncomfortable that can be in a group because they're assumed to be like, let's say, in charge. And they'll be like, I'm not in charge. I'm a follower here, or I'm whatever the circumstances are. So there's these attributes that we have to integrate them. The word that was coming to mind for me was like a more expansive notion of gender characteristics. And I was thinking do you remember, I need to look up this citation again. You've heard about how the first research on like fight, flight, and freeze was repeated to find two more approaches to threat, which are tend and befriend. So you have fight, flight, freeze, tend, which is take care of the children, and befriend, which is form an alliance. Like you were saying in Aikido, if I can't rip someone's arm off, then I better either figure out how to get out of there, or I could also become an ally with them somehow. And that study was repeated with a more diverse set of respondents, not just men, to identify like other ways, in other less just masculine ways, that problems can be solved or threats can be mitigated. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity to this idea of future notions that expand how we think about our innate characteristics.
Love that. Thank you. My brain tells me that Shelley Taylor is the psychologist who came up with a tend and befriend response around the year 2000. And it's a nice opening because I wanted to bring a word back into the conversation. I'm not sure we used exactly this word, but we talked about it a bit, which is awareness. And I think a positive way to rethink masculinity. And I'm going to walk along a ledge because awareness is right next to woke and wokeness. It's right next door. Woke is a kind of awareness. Woke, in its simplest, sort of innocent form, was to be aware that other people were harmed. That was my first exposure to woke. It's an awareness that other people have been harmed and that you maybe ought to notice that and take it into account as you move forward. Sounds great. But men tend not to be emotionally aware. And we talked a little bit about being personally emotionally aware, but emotional work is what women normally do in a group. And one of the reasons I think I'm a pretty good facilitator is that I'm busy reading the room for emotional cues and taking care of people in the room and trying to make sure that things happen and that everybody is heard and that there's a moment where everybody who's been speaking a lot, step back, whoever hasn't had a chance to speak, this is your moment, whatever, drawing people out, whatever it might be. But it would, alongside stewardship and some of these other things, this idea that maybe men could pay a little bit more attention to that rather than deciding to pay attention only to having the right answer and convincing everybody of the right answer.
Yes.
Something like that. Are we asking too much?
I don't think we're asking too much. And I also think that we must value those other ways of being. We must value self-awareness in order to create the kinds of equity we really want. And the reality is, Jerry, like what we're seeing right now is boys and men are falling behind. They're falling behind in school. They're falling behind in college admissions, in medical school admissions. They are dying by suicide, by opioid addiction, by gun violence at a much more rapid rate than women right now. That is what's happening right now. And so, and I'm not a huge fan of the expression toxic masculinity, but what I'm seeing is that our world at large is not helping men and boys feel seen in such a way that they can cope with this difficult world. And so for me, awareness is partly about giving everybody, including men and boys, ways to cope with this brutal, fast changing environment that we're in today's world. I know all times are hard, but like we need skills to understand how to be resilient in the challenging things that we face. And I think that being able to be aware, being able to give permission for learning how to cope at a very young age is super important. And also being very thoughtful. I'm thinking of Jonathan Haidt's work in The Anxious Generation, the data we have about video games and about social media. Like we're actually not becoming, in a meta level, I sometimes worry we're not becoming more aware. We're becoming less aware because of how we're engaging with technology. We atrophying muscles of awareness when we really should be like fortifying that.
It's interesting. I have a push-pull thing with Jonathan Haidt's work because I like some of the things he's done and some of his principles and concepts are great. And then when he says the answer is basically to take devices away from kids, I'm like, no, I don't think that's the right answer at all. I think the answer is this is a moment to actually have a conversation and learn some self-mastery and learn how to use these devices well together and how to lead a life where you have full power over the devices as opposed to them having power over you. Now, the business model of these devices is mostly addiction. That's not Apple's business model, but it's certainly Facebook and TikTok's business model. And so we have that to struggle with because it's very hard to help people to understand self-control or self-discipline in the face of something that's very clearly built out of shiny objects designed to waste your time. Yeah. So there is all of that. But I like that you mentioned that men are dying of despair, their life expectancy is shorter, and the stats are really not good for men these days. And they don't have to be. It seems so strange that we're in this spot. One of our problems is that men don't reach out for help, and we don't reach to them to see if they're okay. We'll reach out to people who look like they might not be okay, but we don't really connect. And in the middle of all this consumerist frenzy, we've lost a lot of the interdependence and community and family life that we used to have. So I think a lot of the longing for the nuclear family that's happening on the far right is a wish to have the connectedness and interdependence of family dinner and the traditional trad family going on, when a non-trad family can be extremely bonded and have all of those attributes and just not the traditional or stereotypical role assignments in there. This is a dynamic of family and community, not of traditional what have you. So we're confusing. These things are all entangled and it's very hard to pull them apart. And the present moment where discourse is being drowned out with anger is making it harder to have those conversations.
Wow. I couldn't agree more. I think that's a good call out around the work of Jonathan Haidt. I love his work. And also, I think you're right. And for me, it's similar to, we can't just keep our children from drugs and alcohol. That's not real. We can't keep them from technology. Their world is riddled with it. What we need to do, and all of us I think need to practice, is learn how can we use it. We have this huge part of our brain that is very vulnerable to getting addicted to things because it's really hard to feel. And so figuring out how do we help each other feel that, and which brings us back to something you just said, which is I think all of us have at our very core a deep need to belong, to feel
Hmm.
seen and accepted for who we are and to belong. And I think that, and I sometimes feel some guilt, I think, as feminism has risen, I sometimes feel some guilt that we have not honored seeing masculinity and men themselves as a beautiful, important part of our society. That being tough, being big, being strong, being into sports, being like those are just
Yeah.
characteristics that men may have that I think sometimes and I'm not blaming feminism, that I'm not blaming feminism for doing that, but I think that there's some work there for us, for my group, which is women, white women in particular, who actually are in many ways the most adjacent to the historical power structure of men. We have a big role of, I think, learning how to redefine what it looks like without demonizing men, with actually embracing and accepting and seeing them for who they are, even though
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
different.
If you've been awake and paying attention to the American left or the progressive wing for the last couple of decades, it's shameful to be an American or a male or white. And
Yeah.
that's the backlash that we're tasting right now. Incredible
Yes.
backlash. Now, I'm all three of those things.
Yeah.
And I don't feel terrible about acknowledging what happened. I was perfectly comfortable. I'm like, yep, the US did a bunch of really crappy things over the years. I catalog them in my brain, my external brain. And yet we've done some great things and we have lots of capacities and so on and so forth. I think that it's very possible to move forward positively with critiques. But we're in a moment where that's not happening. And that's been really tainted. So I'm wondering, how do we get back into a place where we can have realistic conversations about history, the present, and our responsibilities to the future?
Yeah.
And how to pick up in the best way what to be good at to make that future just sparkle. Because right now, one of my little amateur theories of world dynamics is that we are going through an involuntary renegotiation of the social contract around the world because people perceive that the social contract is broken, that their children's lives are going to be worse than their lives are today. And nobody can tolerate that. So from the Arab Spring to Cacerolazos in Spain and in France, to Occupy Wall Street, to the Tea Party, to MAGA, every one of these movements is basically a protest movement about the current set of systems, whether they're rigged or not, or what have you, that they're intolerable. And masculinity is somehow dead in the middle of this nexus. It's not a peripheral issue to the thing I just said. It's really quite central. So if we can find our way to positive masculinity or healthy masculinity, and then find ways to make it really contagious so that it propagates, that can be a huge solution to this problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I was thinking as you were describing the death of things right now, I'm struck with how sometimes as a woman, I actually feel on the outside of all of that because I feel like it's just history repeating itself. But the reality, my reality bumped up against what I'm seeing in the meta environment, which is that my lived experience with men, my friends, my husband, my sons, many of my clients are actually, I know who they are in their bones. They are good people doing good work in loving relationships, learning and creating and being aware. And so it's the majority of men are that. And I think what we're seeing right now is we have a minority of men who are holding on to power, particularly power in two ways. One is financial wealth, to your point around consumerism, and the billionaires are in charge right now. They mostly are men, almost exclusively men, and power, right? We have those two things, money and power. And that's the majority of men that I know don't have that kind of power and they don't have that kind of money. And so they're not feeling those things. They're feeling other things, more shared experience of societal need and society rules. And so I think it's very important to keep telling that narrative around this is a vast minority of people that are living out this toxic notion of masculinity. Unfortunately, it impacts all of the rest of us.
I totally agree. Oh, and boy, does it ever. It really plays out on everybody else. This morning, in one of too many distractions, I learned about Margaret Travers Simons, Symons, who was a suffragette in England. And she was the first woman to speak in Parliament because she was being escorted to a peephole there was where people who weren't allowed on the floor in Parliament could look into what was happening inside the discussions in Parliament. And she escaped her handler and went on the floor and said, don't, stop talking about this. You should talk about like the women's vote. And that just came up in my mind because we're just repeating so many of the old battles over and over again. And reactionary forces really want to go back to a place where we were before that wasn't better in so many ways. One of the things I'm really curious about is how do we meld the best of the old with the best of the new? And not how do we get back to some place we have some melancholy nostalgia for. When young people have nostalgia for an era they never experienced and don't even know much about, I find that very funny. And that seems to be happening, right? It's, oh yeah, things were way back better in those days. You didn't live in those days. You don't really want to be alive before penicillin, for example.
That's right.
A lot
or
of things,
toothpaste.
Or toothpaste, or toilet paper, or I don't know.
Totally. No, it's so true. And I'm a big believer in what's past is past. One of my favorite paradoxes is this one. It's not my fault, and I'm responsible.
Yeah.
And I think living in that paradox is one of the ways we do grow into a future that works, because we don't necessarily get tangled up in having to make repair for our ancestors, because we actually can't. I can remember many years ago, I was a college student. No, it was after college, actually. It was one of my first jobs, and I had a colleague. I was working in the treatment field, substance abuse treatment, and one of my colleagues was from the Lakota Sioux Reservation. His name was Maury. And I was very impacted emotionally by the plight of First Nations people here in our country. And I had a lot of emotionality about it. And we'd watched some movie and I was crying. And he looked at me and he said, Mo, that's cool that you feel sad about this, but you actually won't ever know what this is like in your bones because of who you are descended from. And that's not your fault. But let's not get so swept up in your grief when we have work to do. And it was one of the most powerful pieces of feedback I ever got. And he wasn't saying, oh, repair is impossible, but he was saying, you personally, as Mo, don't own repair for the generations that came before you, who actually, and one of my favorite expressions is, we're doing the best that they could at the time. We were talking about this the other day because it was Columbus Day here in the States. Today.
Yes.
Columbus
Today is
Day,
Columbus Day.
right? Which,
or
some
Indigenous Peoples Day, depending on what state you're in.
Exactly. And we were talking about it, and one of my kids' partners had said, oh yeah, Columbus died in Hawaii. We had this funny joke. I said, no, that wasn't Columbus. That was Captain Cook, who's one of his biographies I just read. It was quite good. And there was a few minutes of conversation about like how both Columbus and Captain Cook were these horrible explorers and the negative things. They demonized, they damaged Indigenous people, which they did. They didn't know what they were doing in a lot of ways. They were operating from a construct where it made sense. But I also felt compelled to say, let's also remember that these men, this is the individual group paradox, isn't it, Jerry? The individuals themselves were good people, probably trying to do good things, and they did do good things. If we hadn't had Captain Cook and Christopher Columbus, we may not have developed some of the ideas that we have. And were there negative consequences? Did they also do bad things? Yes. And so have I. And so how do we move? It is not about moving beyond repair, because I think repair and reconciliation has a place in our society as well. But we also need to transcend into what is it you will do? What can we do together that keeps us, I think, more positively?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the word together has been complexified in the first year of the Trump administration, because together used to mean gender, color, whatever, all cool, come on down, and together we'll sort out what we need to do. And in the military and in lots of other places, this administration is basically saying, yeah, no, there's a whole bunch of people we don't see as part of the together. And that's really going to, I think, throw a wrench in the works. Now, that doesn't mean that every individual can't act as if that had never happened. And that'd be great. That'd be just fine. But even okay, let's look forward together.
Yeah.
Gets is complicated because of things like that.
No, it's totally true.
But
It's totally true. Yeah, go ahead.
just briefly, and I think, and this cuts over into a conversation about leadership in general, but I think it's men's opportunity to lead into these issues by being aware that this is a situation and that it matters, and then behaving in ways that neutralize that situation and that let us move forward productively.
Yes. And I think that what you just said deserves to be underlined. Men have a huge responsibility right now. The majority of men, not the few that we've talked about, the billionaires, the majority of men, I think, actually do have a tremendously important role right now in redefining what it means to be a good man, and also standing fiercely alongside each other and the groups of people who are being in a wholesale way marginalized by our current administration and by authoritarianism globally. That because we can't do it alone. Like, I can't do it. If women, like, I sometimes I fantasize in my mind, like, women can take over, we can be, that's not, are you kidding? We are the persecuted. Black and brown people, gay and trans people, they're not, they are on the outside of what this administration is doing. They're being summarily dismissed and unseen in that space. So we need men to be doing the work that they can do to stand strongly. I was watching one of the admirals, I didn't get his name, speaking about how, in the face of what's happening here in the States with the militarization of cities like yours, Portland, and
the war zone.
Yeah, the war zone. And some of these admirals are now coming out and saying, actually, the oath you take as a service person is to the Constitution. And you are obligated to uphold the Constitution, which of course makes it very complex for certainly enlisted members of the military, but also leaders to discern, okay, I am trained to follow orders, but also this feels wrong. But I was really struck with his courage and his taking his positional authority and saying, I am adherent to the law and to the Constitution for what it is I will say yes to, which takes a lot of courage to counter the bad behavior that's happening that is trying to be above the law.
Absolutely. And yeah, the law is being messed with as well.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It absolutely is. Which is how we have seen genocide begin in all countries where it's occurred. And so for me, it's where I think this conversation starts to get really real about what characteristics as a society, be they masculine or feminine or something in between, are the ones we're gonna value and honor the most.
What facets of this conversation have we not put on the table? Just what might be other ingredients that matter to you, or have we done a reasonable job here?
We've covered an awful lot, Jerry. There's one thing though that I would mention maybe, and I'd love like your opinion on this, because it's certainly something that I think about a lot. We talked about it briefly, but it's this idea of what is leadership? Because I think leadership is one of those words. It's like team. We throw it around and it doesn't mean anything. And there's countless books written on the subject, including 3 of mine. And yet we don't really often, I think, look at our notions of leadership as being gender limited. And I really believe that it is time that we untether leadership from genderized notions of what good leadership looks like. They're outdated. And we see it. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Zima and Tony D'Antonio, not Tony, I don't remember her name. They wrote a book called The Athena Doctrine. They did a really big study, which was looking at what are the characteristics of leadership that matter most globally in the future. And then they asked the question, which of these are feminine and which of these are masculine? And the characteristics that their study, which I think had 10,000 participants in it, that was necessary for the future is the feminine characteristics of leadership. And I have seen in my own practice, 90% of the clients that I work with in the C-suite are men. And their most urgent need is to learn about their own characteristics that might fall in the feminine bucket, like patience and emotional intelligence and social awareness, and those characteristics that are going to be collaboration, that are critical leadership skills. What do you think gets in the way of us really grabbing? We know what good leadership looks like, but we still are not practicing it in so many systems.
I'm unclear we know what good leadership looks like. So let me just set that aside for a second. I love the full title of the book, The Athena Doctrine, How Women and the Men Who Think Like Them will rule the future, written in 2013. I'm afraid that there's like a huge leadership gap right now at so many levels everywhere. And it's funny, in certain conversations, and I haven't had to say this for a while, but I used to say that President George W. Bush Jr. was a pretty good leader because he led this country into a war with a country that didn't attack it halfway around the world, spent $3 trillion in American treasure and a bunch of lives, and then lost that whole thing. But how you get a whole country to go do that thing, that's leadership. I think it's dysfunctional leadership. But leadership often leads us into terrible, stupid things. I think the best leadership is some kind of considered leadership that manages to figure out what are the best options and what might we do that's super productive given where we are and what we're doing. So is Mark Zuckerberg a great leader? He's created a company that has more monthly average users than the populations of China and India combined. And he's a princeling with no adult supervision. Now, that is good leadership in the sense of he grew a company to be enormous and to make such a dent on the world psyche that thinking about how do we shut it down? Do we not let kids use that whole conversation is partly because he did that thing. I don't think that's good leadership. And then we're at a moment where maybe we've been over-reliant on the central government, and maybe all this cutting and slashing that conservatives have wanted to get rid of since FDR and the New Deal, conservatives have been trying to get rid of all the big edifice of government. And I was looking at government going, I'll get rid of the Department of Education and a couple other things myself. Before Trump ever came on the scene, I was like, I don't think they're helping. I think they're hurting us in different ways. But maybe that means corporations need to pick up and lead because corporations are the engines of what happens. And maybe they need to stop thinking that their only responsibility is to make their widget and sell it at a profit and then take as much of that profit as they can and bank it away. Maybe they need to think of themselves as some early industrialist capitalists used to think of themselves, which is, I'm a citizen in society and I need to feed back. And in some cases, they were whitewashing things that they had broken. Carnegie doing public libraries. And there's a whole bunch of ways in which people tried to make up for things that their organizations had done. So maybe that's a long-winded way of saying that I think leadership is really complicated. I did a little horse training nearby here in Portland a couple of years ago, tail end of the pandemic. And I learned that the mayor, the elder mayor, is the leader in any group of in any herd of horses, and she leads from the rear. So and when you're trying to work with a group of horses, you work with her, and wherever she goes, everybody else will go ahead of her. It's very interesting. This is a bit of a lateral thing, but there was an article several years ago that says that matriarchy is not the opposite of patriarchy. And I found it's a great article, and it says, hey, patriarchy is men are in charge, women should be subservient, and here's what that looks like and how that plays out. And there's been plenty of historic societies where we've enforced that strictly. In matriarchy, it's not the opposite. It's not that women are in charge and men are subordinate. It's egalitarian. And there's a whole different way of thinking about it. And then to throw one last angle to it, in a conversation with my Open Global Mind group recently, we were talking about how do we design a platform for social interactions that isn't addictive like TikTok and Facebook and is good for humans. And the very good advice that came out of that conversation is maybe women should be designing that. And I'm like, oh, that's actually a very interesting notion because it would probably be designed in a very different way.
Interesting. I love that. I was reminded as you were talking about, I remember going to the Wonder Woman movie, the newer one that came out a couple years ago. I was just watching the movie like I do, like enjoying movies. And then in one of the pivotal moments of the movie, when you realize that the women are in charge and they are doing good, I just lost it. I just started sobbing because I was like, that's what the mamas would do. That's what we mamas would do. Because I know that in my bones as a woman and as a mother. And so I think there's an awful lot there around what are we preserving? What are we preserving? And I love what you're saying about that leadership can be on both ends of extremes. It can be really bad. It can be really good. And I also think what you said underlines the point that I'm feeling right now, which is it's not so much about Democrats and Republicans, it's about billionaires and the rest of us. And for me, capitalism has taken a turn away from the common good, a way that is a huge factor, as you've said really powerfully, in what we're seeing right now, because we have a blur, the corporations are in charge right now. The very few wealthy benefactors it's not very few, a lot of people are benefiting from the wealth of the corporation. And it really makes it complex. My company was a B Corp for 12 years. We dropped that certification during COVID, but I can remember having leaders in our suite be very curious about that. And some of them would say, I'm already a B Corp because I know that I can't just take resources from my community. I can't just pay people like crap and expect my company to succeed. So they just knit it together. They're like, I already understand that there's a triple bottom line here, people, planet, and profit. And without that, I can't actually build something that lasts. And so it feels like there's a link that's broken, more significantly broken. I think it's always a tension, but I think what you're saying really points to the fact that maybe the question is more, rather than defining what is good leadership, it's really more about what is our economic model, what's broken, and how do we capture it back to something or recreate something new.
Maybe to glue the last little bits of conversation, because we've wandered quite far afield, that there's a moment for men to lead alongside everybody else, us into a world where we rethink the social contract and rewrite the different ways in which we interact and do things. And there's any kind of endless need for that right now.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't show up in some interesting, communicable, transmissible, contagious way, I think the future looks really grim. We're going to be in surveillance autocracies around the world.
Yeah. No, we need it. We definitely need it. And we can't get it by demonizing and having to orphan all things masculine. I think that brings us all the way around. I was struck with a dear friend of mine a couple of years ago. I bumped into him in an airport and he gave me a big hug, and he gave me one of those hugs that's like, bam, on my back. And I was like, oh man, that's a man hug right there. And he goes, that's how we do it, Moe. That's how we men do it. And it got me thinking about, it has to be okay the way men do it, but we need the way men do it to be honoring all, including themselves, which is why I think we need y'all, Jerry. We need y'all.
Yeah, thanks.
So beautiful. What a fun conversation.
Thanks for joining us for this conversation with Moe Carrick about masculinity, leadership, and the future we're building together, or failing to build. As Moe and I discovered, talking about masculinity means talking about almost everything else. Capitalism, community, technology, shame, leadership, and what it means to belong. We can't untangle these threads because they're all woven together in the fabric of how we live. But here's what's clear. We need a vision of masculinity that doesn't require anyone to orphan parts of themselves. We need men to lead alongside everyone else into a reimagined social contract. And we need to do this without demonizing anyone, because shame, as Moe reminded us, only makes people defensive. The majority of men are good people doing good work in loving relationships. They're trying to figure this out too. And the invitation for all of us, men, women, and everyone across the gender spectrum, is to help redefine what healthy masculinity looks like in ways that serve our collective future. If this conversation sparked something in you, I'd love to hear about it. You can find me online or visit my website at jerrymikulski.com. And if you found value in this episode, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. These conversations only matter if we keep having them with honesty, compassion, and courage. Until next time, keep rethinking those constraints.